From the food we eat, to the clothes we wear, to our communication devices. Commodities are the common link. Harnessing these resources for the benefit of the continent has long been hampered due to a lack of a consolidated continental strategy. The African Union Agenda 2063 is the strategic framework developed to provide sustainable economic growth, and amongst its key initiatives is the development of a commodities strategy for Africa.
This is a continent that during the colonial era was essentially meant to provide raw materials into the industrial machine of Europe. There's a very popular quotation by the former African Union chairperson, Madame Zuma, who said, "We're colonized because of our natural or mineral resources. Our position in the global economy today is because of our mineral resources, and our future will be determined by how well we manage our mineral resources." So you have a structure, what I call a structural problem, whereby the raw material is found on the continent, but everything else that went into its production and into its sale or exporting were outside the continent.
Colonialism per se was not about political power. It was about economic power. It was about siphoning out the raw materials to feed into the industries of the West. And this has not stopped. Even though we have been moving towards wanting to trade with the rest of the world, the issue of commodities trade has remained pronounced, literally because it has been the status quo right from the beginning, that Africa produces raw materials, the rest of the world adds value to them, and they come back to Africa as finished products.
Africa has about 12% of the world's oil reserves, 42% of its gold, and 80 to 90% of chromium and platinum group metals. While the global financial crisis did slow development, commodity sector prices have enjoyed successive growth since the early 2000s. Why the continent has failed in its quest into economic diversification for these dividends, the African mining vision now seeks to address.
The Africa mining vision is essentially the centerpiece of the commodity strategy. It was developed as a blueprint to allow the mineral resources to play their transformative role in social and economic structure transformation, to contribute to industrial development. When you look at most of our African countries, they have minerals. But our mineral sector is composed mainly of what I may call external investors. We have, on the other side, artisan and small-scale miners who are scraping the soil for a livelihood, but at the same time, who are our Africa's private sector. So the Africa mining vision looks at, you want to export some of your raw materials. If you export your raw materials, use the money, develop the infrastructure, which are side stream linkages, and build industries for those sectors you want to develop. In this paradigm shift, we need to relook on how do we define our investment policy. Maybe the next investment you need is not outside there, but is in the next country.
The African region today remains one of the most heavily dependent upon the commodity sector for our agro-resources, fuels, and mineral resources. The commodity strategy envisions a robust-led industrialization policy, thereby implementing value-added practices and higher remittances for all our natural resources that we consume and ultimately export.
What we are saying with a commodity strategy by the African Union, including the African mining vision, saying that, look, wait a minute, how do we reorient this structure and make it more internally driven? That is, how do we raise capital domestically which means we need to set up capital markets. How do we get the expertise, the technical skills and knowledge that will help us to develop? And finally, how do we beneficiate or add value to these raw materials so that we can consume them ourselves? And that's the only way we can benefit, let our people benefit from the exploitation of these mineral resources.
In addition to the vast mineral deposits, Africa has approximately 60% of the most arable land on the planet, making our agri-resources the most significant commodity resource for feeding ourselves and exporting to the rest of the world.
I think we need to really work more on this commodity strategy and define what are the commodities, because you have two clusters of commodity. You have the commodities that derives revenue for the continent, which is coffee, cocoa, cotton, all these permanent crops, timbers. And we have the food security commodity, which better fits on this inter-African trade.
I inherited some land on the island, and the idea was you had a situation where you have people basically that are isolated on an island, no infrastructure, with an amazing crop. And so the idea was to see how we connect this product to market and give people an income and get them out of sort of chronic poverty. So what we have to look at, being landlocked here in Uganda, is the local market, the regional market. So really, we already know that a lot of our pineapples go to Kenya, go to Rwanda, go to Burundi, they go to sort of Tanzania, within the region. So there's a huge market for Ugandan pineapple. And in fact, there's a huge global market for pineapple generally. The challenge for Africans or Uganda is that the capacity to produce the volumes required to supply maybe supermarket chain just isn't there, which basically means that our pineapple is then subject to 3 or 4 days of shelf life, perishability, which means we have a lot of product in Uganda basically going to waste. And if you can afford to throw away, tons of organic pineapple and not make an income from it, then really the government has to step in and find a way of turning that waste into product and income for people.
The indications are clear. While economic growth remains strong, increased income generation can be yielded by integrating a fresh approach to our commodity wealth, which will further catalyse the continent's development.
Africa is at crossroads as we speak. They are stuck on whether we continue with the status quo of trading with our raw materials or whether we change the narrative, rewrite the narrative, we shift the paradigm on how can we achieve the aspirations of the people, which are contained in the voice of the Africans as in Agenda 2063.
As one of the flagship projects, the African Commodities Strategy aims to aid member states to extract higher rents for their commodities and integrate more effectively into the global value chains.
If you have a Dangote type of company, which is the biggest cement producer in the whole of Africa, but it does it in a regional scale, so he's able to optimize, and he's a major player, and is owned by an African investor. It can be expanded in the mining sector for a particular producer taking a regional market to be able to optimize that investment and become a supplier to the mining companies. And that will create jobs, that will expand the tax base of a mining investment, as opposed to what we have now, where all the inputs, all the suppliers comes from outside. So the resource owner who has sort of concessioned the resource is getting practically nothing in terms of the value chain.
For me, the heart of the commodity strategy is not about the minerals. It's not about the agriculture commodities. It's not about the oil and gas. It's about a smart Africa. Many Africans are tired of this kind of lamenting as if we have no responsibilities. We are the ones who sign agreements without analyzing them. We are the ones who maybe sometimes think that there's a shortcut to development. It's a long road, and that's a good reason why It's all falling under Agenda 2063. But Agenda 2063 doesn't mean procrastination. It means we start now and we have a phased approach, step by step, in how we're going to get there. There are some inspiring stories across the continent. Let's take agriculture. You know, in Ethiopia, they have the Commodities Exchange, which came as a surprise to everyone. Can you really do that with coffee?
Yes, you can. And with wheat, and with barley, and with maize. The Ethiopian Commodity Exchange has proved that a transparent and secure marketplace environment for all agri-stakeholders can be achieved.
When you look at the regional value chain, the first one is the farmer. The farmer is the one who's actually producing the crops. Then the farmer has to sell these commodities to aggregators, or the people who are actually aggregate the commodities and sell to the next level. Through this system, a lot of transactions happens which are actually adding no value into the commodity. By shortening the value chain, we are planning to add value or margin to the farmer, so that the farmer will get more margin than before. Before, there are so many middlemen in the middle. They are taking the commodity, rebagging and hand it over to another aggregator. We want to reduce that one and to make a farmer to the market. This is how we are trying to make our market a little bit efficient and to have a very short supply chain of commodities in the market.
With commodity prices also being inherently volatile, the imminent implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area should counter this vulnerability by stimulating economic diversification and incentivizing internal continental demand.
The volatility comes as a result of declining demand in the developed country markets and the newly industrialized countries like China. When there's that slump, then you find that the commodities are equally affected. Now we're going to have a situation where a lot of value addition is going to take place in Africa. And therefore, it will be Africa sparing the rise in commodity prices. In the past and historically, Africa has been totally dependent on external forces to determine the price of commodities. But with the African Continental Free Trade Area coming in force, where there's going to be increased demand for commodities within Africa, I think the pricing now will be in Africa's favor.
The situation we are in is much better than the way it is presented. And let me give you some numbers. If you look at what Africa trades within the continent, more than 40% of what we trade with each other is value added. But what we trade with the rest of the world, most of it is basically raw materials. So the African Continental Free Trade Area should actually be read against or seen against the commodity strategies that is being developed. Now, of course, the commodity strategy is not just about tariffs. It's also about the infrastructure requirements. It's also about innovation, because for you to be able to transform these commodities, R&D becomes a critical part and parcel of that. I think the commodity strategy that is part of the Agenda 2063 will be easier to realize once you have the Continental Free Trade Area, once you implement the program for infrastructure development in Africa, and once you continue implementing what we call the science, technology, innovation strategy for Africa, which is also a continental framework within the African Union.
When most of the countries who gained independence tried import substitution, it didn't work. Others, like Tanzania, tried African socialism to give African powers on economic trend. It didn't work. What the missing link was creating an African demand for the same commodities that we produce and which we consume. And the demand is there. The reason we have not been able to command the demand setting is because we have not focused, and our countries have not focused on setting up policies and creating an environment, not for attracting foreign direct investment, but for setting up industries.
The development of an African commodity strategy is closely linked to Africa's industrialization ambitions that will further promote diversification in all African economies.
We will like to continue focusing on transformation of agriculture. Agriculture is absolutely important for us, and we have given it top priority for the last 2 decades. We would like to continue giving special attention to agriculture because agriculture will be feeding industrial inputs for the industry. We need to focus on manufacturing, and the vision we have is to make Ethiopia the leading manufacturing hub by 2025.
While the Commodities Strategy offers member states a pathway to boost development, the initiative will also propel the private sector to innovate and more value-added practices.
If you look at all the maize flour product currently in the market, it's very hard to find something that of a high standard. After I finished in the UK, and I was so impressed with the packaging, with the quality, and especially to the health. And what can we do to improve that? And a lot of people do eat flour, but none of them is bothered about the health side of it or what we can do to improve. For example, one of our minerals is folic acid. It helps a lot for pregnant women. It helps them to deliver child with less diseases and so on. So if you look at what we add, there is so much that benefits the health, and that's one of the things we wanted to bring on board, as well with a good brand and a high quality packaging as well, that we felt that the market lacks this area.
So what we found was that pineapple being such a perishable crop, if we could find a way of extending its shelf life and preserving it, would be a way of adding value to it. And the simplest way that we could think of adding value and preserving it and extending shelf life was one of the oldest methods in the world, which was simply drying. Once you've peeled the pineapple, sliced it and dried it, suddenly you have a product which is lightweight for export, has a long shelf life, and becomes a convenient, healthy option snack. In terms of creating the sort of critical volume to export, you have some time to build up. Whereas some crops demand that you send huge volumes all at once, which puts a strain on the community if they're not up to export standards or export volumes. So those are the sort of things that we found by trial and error.
While the Commodities Strategy is a springboard for a more sustainable pathway to development, it must be implemented by member states who wholly recognize that exporting organic resources without beneficiating while being financially viable in the short term can only offer a fast track to dependency and economic volatility.
The commodities come from Africa. When you say Intel, everybody goes. When you say Apple, everybody goes. When you say Microsoft, when you say Samsung, nobody recognizes Africa. Now, if we can, at least in the next 10 years, try to add value to those commodities that we can control competitively, then we shall have our own terms and we shall control the economy of the world, and we have that potential.